In my opinion, a Fabled Unicore deck is one of the most skillful decks to play in the game, and one of the most annoying for the opponent. For those who are not familiar with the card, it is a 2300 attack point synchro monster that negates and destroys any opponent card effect when both players have the same number of cards in hand, no matter where the card activates. On the field, negate it. In the graveyard, negate it. Hand traps, negated. The general strategy behind Fabled Unicore is to end your turn with the same number of cards as your opponent, for when the opponent draws one card, the first card played from the hand will always be negated. However, it is also important to run cards that can easily manipulate hand size during your opponent's turn. So when building a Fabled Unicore deck, there are two important issues to consider. One, getting Unicore on the field quickly and consistently. Second, having sufficient options for hand manipulation. Starting off, I run 2 copies of Fabled Unicore because obviously 1 copy isn't enough, 3 copies too many. Second, Fabled Unicorn requires a Fabled tuner. Thus, a Fabled monster will certainly be central in deck building. Of the available tuners, only 2 actually have useful effects outside of being tuners, Raven and Cerburrel. The usefulness of both of these monsters is also augmented by the fact that they are level 2s, the value of which will be revealed in the near future. Raven can help manipulate hand size, especially when going second, and depending on how much your opponent has played to try to get that matching number so you can start negating their effects. And Cerburrel can be innately special summoned as a result of numerous discard of card effects. I don't run Raven because in the past, mass discarding was valuable because it was common for the opponent to dump most of their hand as back row or something to that effect, just play a lot of cards in sequence. However, that hand dumping strategy is less popular in the current format, in part because so many more tribute monsters are run now. You're going to probably start seeing a lot of Blue Eyes decks. There's tribute monsters. Monarch players run tribute. Cosmos run a lot of high-level monsters. And second, it's difficult to just dump the hand with Raven now because it becomes wasteful, as some of the top meta decks have additional +1 engines like Cosmo Town and certain spell trap cards in Monarch decks that can be banished from the graveyard. So Raven becomes a lot less useful and a lot more of a gamble to run now. I do run 3 copies of Cerburrel. Cerburrel is a level 2 beast which partners well with a number of other level 2 beast options for making Unicore, and is also compatible with one of the best spell cards in the game, Obedience Schooled. Activating Obedience can be an automatic Unicore with good probability for another either rank 2 XZ monster, and due to the beast requirement it's more than likely going to be number 64, or another low-level beast synchro monster. 3 copies of Obedience Schooled are basically a must for any Fabled Unicorn. Running Obedience School demands running a number of other level 2 or lower beast monsters to maximize its use. For the selection, it is important to consider how useful the monsters will be outside of their use with Schooled, because Schooled negates their effects. For me, I like running 1 copy of Wind-up Kitten for monster bounce. This is especially useful against Monarchs for opening up the extra deck when March isn't on the field and they can be targeted. 2 copies of Baby Raccoon Ponpoko for field control. 2 copies of Baby Raccoon Tantan for more field control and deck thinning. 3 copies of Valerifawn, Mystical Beasts of the Forest, for additional summoning and triggering Cerburrel's effect. That special summoning is pretty important because you can get it right away and go into something from the extra deck. And 1 copy of Kalantosa, Mystical Beast of the Forest, for card destruction. Finally, I like running 1 copy of Uniflora, Mystical Beast of the Forest, as my level 1 Earth Beast to set up Naturia Beast summonings off of Obedience Schooled, as well as use its effect to grab something from the graveyard when it's applicable. Also, with so many beast monsters, I like running 2 copies of Ayres Rock Sunrise, which can even revive a properly summoned Unicore. Moving focus to hand manipulation portion of the design, I run 3 copies of Legacy of Yata, which is basically Jar of Greed, with the extra bonus effect of that second draw that will probably never be activated, but there is that 2 tribute spirit I think that's coming out in the distant future that people might start running, so maybe you'll get the draw off that, I don't know. Some people like running Reckless Greed as well, but I don't, because losing those future draw phases just to typically negate 1 card is frequently not worth it for me. For losing those draw phases takes away adjustment flexibility, increasing the probability that your opponent gets to a position where Unicore cannot negate their effects, Basically, if those two draws do not provide flexibility, it can be more difficult to match hand size, and without draw phases, your position becomes more tenuous. This is especially true when both those drawn cards are monsters, because you can only normal summon one monster, and Unicore decks typically don't run a lot of innate special summoning monsters, and especially this deck. Overall, I really only play Reckless Greed when its speed could help me initiate a draw engine faster, like something like Volcanics, and this deck does not have that type of draw engine. In addition, some discard cards are required as well. I like running 2 copies of Phoenix Wing Wind Blast and 3 copies of Twin Twister, both widely used for field disruption and requiring a discard. I think a number of people have forgotten how annoying Wind Blast can actually be, and since any card on the opponent's field can be targeted, not just monsters, the anti-targeting issue in some decks is less pertinent. For Unicore decks, the most perilous time is when the opponent draws, as this is the moment when the opponent will typically have a different number of cards in hand relative to the Unicore player, because again, the strategy typically is have the same number of cards in your hand as your opponent's hand and your end phase. This makes all face-down cards live, as well as any graveyard activating effects that involve involuntary banishing. Little can be done about the set cards in my opinion, without negatively impacting the overall functionality of the deck. The best strategy is to destroy those cards with Twin Twister and hope for the best. However, banishing from the graveyard can be dealt with rather easily by simply running either Necro Valley or Imperial Iron Wall. Running Necro Valley, though, can be a little risky because it eliminates your own recursion cards like Ayres Rock and Valerifawn, so I prefer to run 2 copies of Imperial Iron Wall. Iron Wall is also important for stopping meta decks +1 engine in Cosmos Towns for Cosmos by limiting the amount of fuel that they have to draw from, and the banishing effect for certain Monarch spells and traps. For the final monster, I like running 2 copies of Spirit Reaper. Spirit Reaper produces 2 solid benefits for this deck. First, it is still a quality stall card that can control the field against a number of decks, allowing you to set up your next few plays. 2, one of the chief goals of a Unicore deck, in my opinion, is getting the opponent handless as soon as possible, because a top-decking opponent maximizes the negation potential of Unicore. Not only does Spirit Reaper's discard effect accomplish this goal, but it also limits the opponent's ability to stack the hand to break negation in the next turn, or even future turns after that. Closing out the rest of the deck, I run a number of generic staples: the 1 Raigeki, 1 Soul Charge, 1 Bottomless Trap Hole, 1 Solemn Warning, 1 Vanity's Emptiness. Also, I like running 1 copy of Upstart Goblin and 1 copy of One Day of Peace. Now, some may question One Day, but remember, Unicore is not always going to be on the field, and you don't have to activate One Day either. Basically, One Day is another more specific equalizer card, as well as a break the glass in case of emergency card. Finally, at only 2300 attack, Unicore can be commonly run over, despite its negation ability. 2300 attack isn't nearly what it used to be in Unicore's so-called heyday. Thus, I feel it's necessary to run some attack augmenters. I like running 1 copy of United We Stand and 2 copies of Moon Mirror Shield to limit the ability of Unicore just to get thrown into the graveyard by sheer raw attack power. While Compulsory Evacuation Device is definitely a viable option for this deck, I don't like it because against the meta it's too much of a negative and it's also too unreliable, and realistically returning to your hand one of your own monsters to attempt to match hand size is not economical in this meta. Some might wonder about the lack of hand traps in this deck. While true that hand traps can provide an effective and almost surefire way to reduce hand size because you don't have to set them, leaving them vulnerable to stray back row removal, the current format does not lend itself well to hand traps in my opinion. Especially for this deck. I don't like Max C in this deck because it can really screw up your hand equalization probabilities, and this deck doesn't have a lot of explosive power to take advantage of those extra draws. For me, if I was facing a Fabled Unicore deck, I would definitely take the Max C challenge every time it was presented. Effect Veiler can only be dumped from the hand under certain limited circumstances, definitely hurting its value as a hand equalizing agent. Overall, the only hand trap I would really consider running is DD Crow because it has a generally useful effect and can be activated almost any time. So I put DD Crow in my side deck, but I don't run it in my main deck. power. For the extra deck, beyond the 2 copies of Fabled Unicore, I basically run the best rank 2s in an assortment of mid-level synchros. 3 copies of number 64 Ronin Raccoon, 2 copies of Sky Calvary Centurea, 1 copy of Red Wyvern, 1 copy of HTS Psyhemuth, 1 Naturia Beast, 1 Fabled Ragin, 1 Ally of Justice Catastor, I run 1 copy of Old Entity Hastur, 1 Fabled Kudabbi, and 1 Herald of the Arclight. Overall, as I mentioned in the intro, Fabled Unicore is one of the most brainy decks in the game because you have to be aware of both your play as well as your opponent's play potential and be ready to counter it effectively. Also, you need to be well aware of when summoning Unicore is smart and when it's not smart, because just getting Unicore on the field as fast as possible is not always the best idea. Having a deck that has the capacity to get it on the field as fast as possible is definitely what you should be shooting for, but tapping into it is not always appropriate. Negation is definitely the modus operandi for this deck, with the power supplied by the Equips belt and by number 64. Well, that's my Fabled Unicore deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.